If we recognize ourselves as indebted to previous generations for our language, for the technologies that we use, for our very world and ourselves, we begin to act in a way that makes room for future generations because we feel grateful.
Hello and welcome to the Fourth Space podcast. This episode began as part of the 3-day conference hosted at the Fourth Space entitled Justice Between Generations. It was conceived as more of a workshop than a conversation, and Rebecca Vanderpost, Miyu Bao, Joëlle Dubé, and Leah Edmonds came together to consider the question of what justice for future generations really means at a time of catastrophic environmental crisis, and they're reflecting critically upon agency, appropriation, and emotion, and interrogating the assumed relations between self and the world across generations, and hoping to find that moment where we all could ask, how else might we be? Thanks for listening. We would like to begin by acknowledging that Fourth Space and Concordia University are located on unceded Indigenous lands. The Kayunkahaga Nation is recognized as custodians of the lands and waters on which we gather, and Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. We respect the continued connections with the past, the present, and the future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community.
Before diving in, I would like each participant to introduce themselves.
Thanks, Joelle. My name's Rebecca Vanderpost, and I'm originally a concert violinist. I've been a performer for some 3 decades, actually. And I'm now doing my PhD in interdisciplinary humanities here at Concordia. My home base really is Marxian critical theory, but I'm also working in critical aesthetics, anarchist political theory, sensory anthropology, and phenomenology. And at the center of this sort of big swirling kind of domain is a really persistent fascination that I have with the things that happen to us when we lose our self-awareness and become immersed or absorbed in whatever it is that we happen to be doing. And I find that these moments that sort of punctuate our more habituated day-to-day experiences raise all sorts of questions that fall into 2 main groups. The first group is really to do with the nature and the scope and the qualities of non-alienated experience and the possibility of non-instrumentalizing relations between subject and object, or humans and the world that we inhabit. And the second sort of domain stands in contrast to this, which is to sort of ask, well, why do we persist in behaviors that we know to be destructive? Why do we persist in behaviors that we know to be leading us headlong into catastrophe? So all of this folds roughly and loosely under the question of really whether there's some dimension of human experience that's actually available to us and that is external, nonetheless, to Western modernity, and whether we have access, how we have access to this experience, and whether it in some way might help to point us towards other ways to go about the business of being a human being.
Hi, everyone. My name is Miyu Bao. I'm an international student doing MA in philosophy at Concordia University. It's my 2nd year here. I have been interested in free will and moral responsibility for 5 years. It's a long time. And especially Peter Strawson's reactive attitude theory of moral responsibility. I'm very interested in how moral sentiments such as resentment, indignation, forgiveness, guilt, and shame, etc., provide foundation of moral responsibility. Guilt and shame are intertwined with each other in some sense, but it's very weird that most philosophers admit that guilt is a reactive attitude, whereas they deny that shame is a reactive attitude. The reason why they hold this view is that they hold a very narrow understanding of reactive attitude, in the sense that reactive attitudes are reaction to the violation of moral obligation, which is embodied in our modern Christian and Western cultures. But in fact, our practice of holding moral responsibility is far beyond the violation of moral obligation. So I want to argue that shame, or at least moral shame, is a reactive attitude, and we should hold a broader understanding of moral responsibility. Thank you.
Thanks, Amy. So my name is Leah Edmonds. I'm in my second year of the philosophy master's program here at Concordia. So my areas of study are, continental philosophy broadly, but more specifically phenomenology, existentialism, and post-structuralism. I'm also interested in the history of philosophy, particularly German idealism and Kant. So my current research project pertains to funerary practices, kind of revolving around the questions of why humans across history have performed funeral rites, what they do for us phenomenologically, and the more prescriptive question of whether there are better and worse ways of responding to the death of others. So for the sake of this project, I'm looking at two converse ways of interpreting funerary practices. The first interpretation, for which I take Hegel as the main reference, is that humans bury their dead in order to mitigate the loss that is death. That is, to spiritually immortalize the dead. The second interpretation, which I'm developing in reference primarily to Heidegger's later work, as well as Derrida and some others, is that funerary practices serve as a reminder of our mortality and offer a venue to grieve in community the fragility and finitude of human life. My background is in theater, so I am especially interested in gatherings and performance and what can be done when people are gathered together in person. So while both of these interpretations here, I've sort of delineated two possibilities for funerary practices. I think they're both correct interpretations and they have their place, but I think that it's worth considering, perhaps even encouraging an approach to funerary practices that make room for the consideration of death as death and death as an absolute limit. Thank you.
So thank you everyone for your short presentations. My name is Joëlle Dubé. I'm in my second year of my PhD in humanities. My main three fields are philosophy, artistry, and studio arts. I'm interested in the Western relationship to alterity. I am postulating basically that the dominating mode of relating to alterity is one that is rooted in this cannibalistic model of wanting to assimilate and devour the other. And I think that's really what is at stake in the intergenerational injustices. It's basically a lack of letting the other live as deciding for them. And I am positing that contemporary art, alongside deconstruction, decolonial practices, and indigenous methodology, can help us detangle the most primary dualistic opposition that is at the root of this cannibalistic model, that is the dialectic opposition between inside and outside. But yeah, enough of this. I think we are interested in today in seeing how all of our research are overlapping and what happens at those intersections. I think we can all agree that the present tense is riddled with crisis, be it environmental, social, or political crisis. So how does those crises influence the possible futures we can think of? And also what can be said of the temporal nature of those crises? And what happens when the consequences of those crises are promising to stretch out far into futures? This informal discussion seeks to explore those questions under three main themes: temporality, agency, and human positionality. So I'll start off with a question regarding time, and especially the past. So how can the way we relate to past generations inform how we might relate with the unborn?
So I have sort of 2 points in this regard. First is that I think if we can recognize that something is irrevocably lost in the past, in the passing on of generations, we begin to be able to think of our finitude, the finitude of our own lives and of our generation. And I think it's only in realizing this limit that we can make room for the alterity of the future, and thereby generate sort of a respect for the freedom for the alterity of future generations. So we have to be willing to let go of the past in some respects, let go of any wish for our own mortality in order to make room for the future. So that's one point. And then the other point is that I think the modern notion of selfhood forgets the ways that every self is indebted to those who came before us. So we imagine ourselves as sort of created ex nihilo. However, if we recognize ourselves as indebted to previous generations for our language, for the technologies that we use, for our very world and ourselves, we begin to act in a way that makes room for future generations because we feel grateful.
I'm wondering if you could say a few more words about the relationship between finitude and gratitude and inheritance, because on the one hand, there seems to be this sense that the past is past, things are done. But on the other hand, there seems to be something else that is sweeping forwards in what you're saying. And I'm wondering how these two elements relate to each other.
It's definitely sort of they're contradictory seeming points, but I think that sort of captures what is. So I think that as we are now, we think that we can have it all. And that really begets the kind of consumerism that we all kind of engage in. But if we recognize that the past had something that we can't have, then we realize that we can't have it all, and that the future will have something different than we can have.
But then I'm wondering what that means in terms of how we orient ourselves to the future, and whether this in some way might undermine the sense of wanting to leave a better world for the future. Is there a contradiction there? Or?
So I think, I work with kind of the Heideggerian notion of being towards death. And I think I detect some concern that if we are aware of our own finitude, we won't care what comes after us. Mm-hmm. And I think that's why we need this piece that says the I that I'm concerned about is not something that I made. It's something that others gave me, mm-hmm. that everyone that came before me, the natural world allowed me to take a turn with, to use Matthias's language. And that because I was given this opportunity at life, I have sort of a duty and obligation to pass it on. Mm-hmm. So the notion of being a vessel, I think, is a good one. A good sort of metaphor for what's going on here is something pours through me. Because it's been poured into me, I need to pour it on to the future.
Yeah, so how can we distinguish our moral responsibility to past generations from our moral responsibilities to future generations?
Leah talked about the openness for the future, like we can admit the possibility. But the thing is, Galen Strawson proposed a basic argument against free will, like they're actually who we are is determined by who I was before, and who I was before is determined by the thing before that, and we can trace back everything to our bornness, all this stuff, which are far beyond our control. So in this sense, it seems like we don't have an open future, and we just have one future. And I want to have a dialogue with Leah. I'm kind of skeptical about free will, and I don't know how Hegel can respond this kind of thought.
Yeah, so I made the comment before that I think that we should think of ourselves as being indebted to the past, to the earth, and that this sort of I is maybe problematic in that it seems to imply sort of a self-creation, a self-birth. And so that sounds like it could be a kind of determinism, but I want to say that there is room for possibility. I want to say that there is a gap. There is places for ways of being that we couldn't have ever predicted. And that's because, I think that there's always, in any human decision, it's not decided beforehand. Some radical locking in happens in the moment of decision. So my question to you is what is the point of making prescriptive claims in philosophy, or having, conferences where we talk about this issue of the future and what can we do about it if everything's determined in advance?
Yeah, actually, this is a very good question. But I have a deep feeling that I think analytical philosophers are afraid of change, afraid of time. Yeah, and when they talk about moral responsible agency or just the self, it's more like everything is just determined by external thing or just internal thing. But as you said, it's kind of weird to say we human cannot do anything, even now or in the future. We can make some change for future, and but I still think we should keep in mind that we are just a human being and we are limited by human nature in some sense. In one sense, we can trace back to past to learn something from the past, and then we can still make some change for future. And I can also go back to our question, like even if we adopt a determinist approach to more responsibility, I still think more responsibility is possible, whereas against some philosophers just as Jolle think more responsibility is impossible if the thesis of determinism is true. The approach I take to this question is Peter Storson's view of reactive attitude theory of moral responsibility. Basically, Peter Storson wants to see our moral sentiments such as indignation, resentment, guilt can provide foundation for more responsibility. Shame is a very good example. Like we feel ashamed of lack of concerns for future generations, such as destroying environment or running out of natural resources. And in this situation, we can say we shouldn't do something we feel ashamed to do. And in this sense, a sense of shame can be an internal monitor, which requires a satisfaction of ethical considerations. In this sense, I think a sense of shame or a good sense of shame can navigate our behavior now to create a better society for future generations.
What I'm hearing is that there's a possibility that our emotional life is, and particularly the negative emotions such as shame, are not just about authorship. But what you were saying just at the end suggests that there's a way in which emotions are agential, in that they influence what follows, such that what follows is different than it would be if that emotion were not palpable to us.
Yes, I totally agree with this view. There is a good example, like all this so big social movement. Anger plays a very important role in this movement. Like we feel anger of treating Black people badly, or we feel resentment and we feel ashamed of how Aboriginal people were treated by the Canadian government before. So in this sense, like our moral sentiments such as resentment, anger, and shame can let us know something is wrong and something injustice happens, and we need to change this unhealthy social environment and to create a better future.
Yeah, thanks for that. That leads me to another question, because we've talked about the relationship to the past and the future. What about the present? How does the present influence our relationship with other temporalities, or how does our relationship with the present, be expanded in the past or in the future?
Yeah, things that I've been thinking about in relation to this question. One of my sort of big concerns is that as sort of modern Western beings, our orientation, we think of ourselves as being short-term in our thinking, very immediate in our wants and our desires. And yet at the same time, even within that moment of wanting to improve one's own situation, there's still an orientation towards the future. I want to do something right now in order that the next thing is better. And so I feel that our overall orientation is pointed away from the immediate present tense, always towards the next thing, always what's around the next curve in the road. But actually, I think that it's more interesting to think about ways in which that may be who we're required to be. We live in a world that requires us to develop ourselves. But at the same time, sometimes I think we come in most fully into our own when we completely lose track of all of that, and when we become completely lost in whatever it is we're doing, and we've lost all sense of what it was we were trying to accomplish or hoping to achieve. And my feeling is that these moments furnish a slightly different phenomenological field. There's a different framing of the possibilities in our reality. Different things emerge, different possibilities make themselves, they announce themselves to us. And we find ourselves doing things that we hadn't planned to do, or we hadn't even sort of imagined were possible. And so my sense is that these are moments that connect us in a different way to time, a different way to matter. We become receptive to matter. Matter isn't a tool to be turned into something else. It is something that is ripe with possibilities and makes those possibilities known to us. So agency doesn't seem to quite work in these moments. Something else is going on. Things are happening in a way that it can't be attributed to a willful intention that we see through. It can't even be attributed to my intention, because strictly speaking, I'm not there at these moments. There isn't a self-conscious, self-aware I that's at the helm of what's happening. So I think that the present tense affords the possibility for a completely different relationship with the way in which we move through time. And it may be a way of moving into the future that helps us to overcome a certain instrumentalizing mindset that I think has framed our understanding, our self-understanding for a long time.
When we're thinking of problems like climate change, it would seem to at least many people that what we need to do is plan, predict what the outcomes are going to be if it gets to be 2.5 degrees warmer, and how we're going to prepare for that. And who is it going to affect? And so I wonder, how can this sort of radical responsiveness treat this problem of climate change, or at least help us on our way in a different sort of understanding of nature and the earth?
I think that one of the things that the notion of agency does is to exclude from the calculative end of our understanding all the things that happen that we have no control over whatsoever. And for every agentially intended and accomplished outcome, the myriad things that happen that we have no control over and that we couldn't prevent even if we tried. My own agency is, if we look at it just numerically, it's probably statistically quite insignificant in terms of the number of things that happen that I cannot direct. So much of what we do now is to counteract the side effects of the unintentional, non-intended, non-foreseen consequences of earlier agential activities. So I'm very drawn at the moment to the thinking of people such as Bookchin, even Heidegger in a certain way, who says, well, no, we perceive ourselves as being able to determine a future. And it's sort of a nonsensical hubris. And perhaps, as Bookchin says, if things are to change, if radical change is to be possible, every single aspect of our experience of ourselves and our world will be different. We can't simply carry on being the same people and focusing continually on the outcomes that we want and that we plan for, and think that in any way anything's going to change as a result of that. We have to recognize the limitations and the problems of that way of thinking and find other ways in which things happen without this constant imposition of a prescriptive outcome.
Thank you. That was a wonderful response. And so just to sort of repeat what you're saying, what you're getting at, this receptivity, the living in this present awareness, as opposed to a more predictive goal-oriented mode, would cause us to be more perceptive of what we're crushing, what we would crush if we were kind of to beeline towards our objectives.
Yeah, it's all about the detour, getting rid of the beeline, and allowing the detour to become the thing that we're doing.
To become the path.
Yeah,
the Heideggerian sort of
that kind of thing. Yeah, yeah.
I think this all this discussion that you just had is interesting in regards to agency, or the lack thereof, or interest trying to level the human agency with other kind of agencies as well. And I think it's also central to what we are all interested in. So I would like to ask you, who would you envision the unborn to be, and how would you define or understand their agency? And could we even transpose how you define the kind of present tense agency into the future? Would that even be possible? Could that be reframed in future terms?
I don't know. I sort of, based on the work that you're doing, I sort of feel as if I want to turn that question back to you. I mean, I think that my work is precisely to do with not trying to visualize who these future, the unborn, the not yet, but rather find a way to allow that to emerge from possibilities born of non-domination and non-hierarchical relations between us and the world. So, but I'm dying to hear about cannibalism and consumption, because I think this has a lot to bring to that.
I think we all kind of touch a bit on capitalism and this consumption, I think there's this real by interacting with the future the way we are doing currently, we are just devoiding it of any agency. I'm seeing it like that, and I feel like it also is devoiding us of any real possibility for imagining different futures than that, and then the one that are prescribed by capitalism. There's this idea of realist capitalism, whereas it's basically just the extension of present into the future. That's kind of the only mainstream, I guess, future that we can think of. And I feel like art, under various forms, can make us see how. No, I mean, then maybe Amy, you won't agree with me, but I feel like art can show us different futures and different avenues that. It's just too hard for us in like day to day to just think of those possibilities. So I'm curious what you would think of that, Amy.
I actually, when Becky talked about her view on agency, I was wondering if the moment has no particular orientation, and like agency in some sense is unintentional. So in this sense, is it possible to create a better future for next generations? Like we cannot plan for something for future. So how to create a better society?
Yes, how to create a better world, I don't know. And I would be very, very, very afraid of anybody who believed that they did know the answer to that question. But I do believe that we can create a better present moment. I do believe that we inhabit a reality that is ripe with possibilities that we're blind to most of the time, because we're so intent on the next thing that we have to do, the next thing we have to achieve. And my suspicion is that finding a way to step sideways out of the particular instrumentalizations and hierarchies of subject and object that really frame the way in which the world speaks to us at the moment and the way that we respond to it points towards a different kind of future. But what that future looks like, I don't know. How we get there, I don't really know. But I think that it may be helpful to think less about what kind of future we want and more about how can we re-inhabit the present moment in a different way. The question then is there a way to open possibilities? Yeah.
I really like thinking of the future as this alterity that we don't want to control, that we don't want to morph to our own sort of preferences or expectations. But I mean, it's not like we have no access to the future whatsoever. I mean, we have young people all around us, I'm relatively young and I have, opinions that, I would like for, great big oil manufacturers and to ask me about, right? So like it's not like we have to know what people 4 generations down the line want. We just, talk to indigenous people, talk to environmentalists that are resisting the projects of capital and of instrumentalization of all kinds. Listen to the animals and the sort of the hints that we're getting from the earth, right? And yeah, so I feel like you have something to say to this.
Well, yeah, I was just thinking of an example that might be helpful. And I'm thinking of Bill Mollison, who started the permaculture movement. And when he was living in Tasmania, he, for years, was petitioning the government and trying to mobilize change to protect the shoreline in Tasmania, to protect the ecostructures, the very delicate ecosystems that held the shoreline together. Nothing was happening, nothing was changing. He felt that all his energies were being spilled into sort of this wasted political mobilization that was accomplishing. He had a very specific goal in sight and he was trying to mobilize towards that goal, and nothing was happening. And so in the end, in complete frustration, he decided to just stop doing that and grow vegetables. and so I just think he's a marvelous example of somebody who stepped out of one kind of mindset and into another. He decided to inhabit the present moment in the way that he felt was necessary for that present moment to be non-violent and non-destructive and open. And so the permaculture movement actually has accomplished all sorts of things that governments around the world have completely failed to accomplish. And I think that may be a sort of live example of a shift in mindset that could be helpful.
Yeah, and I can imagine if that shift in mindset occurred, with some of the richest, most powerful people in the world and people that are invested in projects of building pipelines across country. If they tried to live a little bit more in the moment and tried to listen to everything that was happening around them instead of beelining forth to their profit, to their expectations, then we would be, I think, relieved of some of the destruction and we could find newer, creative, less destructive ways of moving forward, of wandering forward.
Yeah, but I think that we have to, I don't think we can put the problem over there and just sort of park it on the laps of the billionaires and carry on. Because at the end of the day, Amazon is rich because of the billions of cheap T-shirts that are being bought, and and right there is the problem, that it's the orientation of each one of us.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, I would love for millionaires to become artists, or at least to spend a year or two in art school.
Some are, but that's another problem. I feel like it's almost all the time we've got, and I don't want to, take too much time. But I wanted to thank all our panelists for, having this discussion, and Fourth Space for having us. And we are excited to see the other conferences that are in the coming few days. So thanks to everyone.
If you have an idea for a podcast, please let us know. You can contact us by email at info.4@concordia.ca or find us on social media at CU Fourth Space. We'd love to hear from you. The Fourth Space podcast is hosted by me, Douglas Moffat, and produced with Anna Voklavec. Editing by Chanel Lees Marshall and Maximus Delmar. Social media and web support by Kari Volmstead. And our theme music, courtesy of Supercontinent. Thanks for listening.